When Professor Rebecca Langley decided to put Barron Trump in his place, she didn't expect that he would turn her entire argument upside down. He exposed the weaknesses of her economic theory, accused her of manipulating the facts, and shocked the entire audience. Not only that, he proved that even the most brilliant ideas can be wrong. Don't miss how Barron caused a storm in a Berkeley classroom and left Langley speechless. Don't believe he could beat the professor? Watch until the end and see for yourself. When Professor Rebecca Langley walked into the Berkeley classroom, she was full of confidence. This was her turf, her intellectual battleground, and she knew that today, once again, she would be in the spotlight. But, as so often happens, Langley underestimated one man, Barron Trump. She walked up to the board, her lecture notes folded in her hands, and glanced around at the students who were watching her with interest. Barron sat in the front row, reserved as always, not giving away the slightest glance. Langley couldn't help but notice that this young man, the son of a former president, always kept a little aloof. But she was sure she could handle him easily. Today we're going to talk about the consequences and redistribution of wealth. Barron, why do you think capitalism benefits the rich so much? She asked with her bag, deliberately veering the question to put him in an awkward position. Langley had expected the standard defense of capitalism that students who grew up in rich families often gave. She could almost hear Barron's answer, that everything was right, and that the poor should work harder. Barron looked up and responded, but his words were far from what Langley had hoped. I don't agree that we should just prop up a system that ignores people's real concerns. Yes, the rich win, but why are we so afraid of change? His voice was even and confident. The students began to glance at each other, as if they sensed that this debate might not be so simple. Langley chuckled and decided to act. You talk about change, but what exactly are you proposing? Raising taxes on the rich? It's been proven for so long that those things don't make real change. She paused, waiting for Barron to falter. She was about to play her biggest card, the claim that government programs for the poor are a serious solution. But Barron didn't give up. He held his head up, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his whole life. I'm not talking about just raising taxes. I'm talking about reforms that bring people, not politicians, into the system. We're spending billions on programs that don't really solve the problem, they just manage poverty as if it were something that can be controlled. The students fell silent, and Langley felt her confidence begin to crumble. Suddenly, Barron concluded that the real problem was not a lack of funds, but how those funds were being rebuilt and used. The policies you propose are not the solution. They are maintaining the status quo. What is needed is not just more benefits, but a real change in how jobs are defined and economic mobility is provided. And this, of course, is what you call progressive economics? Langley replied mockingly, trying to regain control. But there was already a note of alarm in her voice. The students listened with great interest, and Barron continued, not giving her the slightest chance to move. Yes, and this is not ideology, this is facts. We can't just give money and expect it to make a difference. We have to create real emergency capabilities. His voice was decisive, and Langley felt her argument begin to lose its force. The students who had seemed ready to support her just a moment ago were now beginning to think twice. Langley hadn't expected this turn of events. She was used to being at the center of debates, and now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the upper hand. Barron Trump, reserved and calm, had challenged her self-confidence. This student, who had been considered an easy target, was now ready to show that he could not only defend ideals, but also turn any argument to his advantage. Do you really think your ideas work, or are you just repeating them because it's safe? Barron said, and this time his words sounded less like a challenge than a question Langley couldn't answer clearly. It was a moment when the audience realized that this debate was just beginning. When Langley tried to turn the corner and use Scandinavia as a model for her argument, she felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crumble. She was sure that this was her trump card. Who wouldn't understand that everything is perfect in Scandinavia? High taxes, strong social welfare, these countries seemed to her the ultimate proof of successful progressive politics. Barron, let's hear your argument, she began, trying to get a handle on the economic recovery. You talk about reform, but don't you see that in Scandinavia, it's high taxes and social programs that have made these countries so prosperous? Isn't that an example to follow? Barron looked up, where he seemed to understand where Langley was leading him. He could have easily changed his mind and simply turned the topic in his direction, but instead his answer was unexpected and very precise. Professor, You forget that it is precisely in countries where highly developing market economies exist. Their model does not work without a strong sector, without entrepreneurship, without innovation. The students glanced at each other. Langley was momentarily taken aback. This was not a standard response from a student who was supposed to be defending capitalism. Barron argued, giving her no time to counter. The Scandinavian countries can afford to tax them so much because they already have strong, dynamic economies that create wealth. Unlike us, we have too many social programs that simply require the status quo. But what about the poor? Langley tried to object. What about social justice? Are you saying these programs are useless? Barron responded calmly. I'm not saying they're useless. But we have to understand that they don't address the fundamental issue of creating other economic opportunities for people. We can't just hand out money and expect it to lift people out of poverty. That's just a stopgap. We have to build a system where everyone has a chance to succeed. And to do that, we need more than just raising taxes on the rich. Langley tried to counterattack, but her arguments seemed increasingly weak and unconvincing. But in these countries, people don't need these measures because they already have support at all levels. We're not just thinking about the rich, but about creating a society where everyone can feel part of something big and stable. Barron looked at her with mild surprise. You're forgetting your business, Professor. In high-tax countries, it's not just the rich who pay, it's the middle class, too. That model is only possible because they have a huge private sector and a strong market economy. For us in the U.S., that model will only work if we create a more stable environment for business and entrepreneurship. And we don't have that. Langley stepped back, trying to process the uniqueness. Barron sounded less like a student and more like someone who wasn't just repeating ideas but actually analyzing the situation. His words made her look at her usual arguments from a different angle. So you're saying that everything I say is just empty words? Langley, desperate to regain control. What about the poor people who can't find work? Barron didn't flinch. I'm not saying the poor should go without help, but instead of just keeping them alive, let's create real conditions for growth, for new jobs. We can't just manage poverty. We have to give people the tools to choose out of it. These words sounded so convincing that even the most staunch of Langley's listeners began to doubt. The students no longer sat as indifferently as before. They began to discuss in whispers, and some even openly supported Barron, throwing approval in his direction. Langley felt her plan unravel before her eyes. Barron Trump was not a student she could simply put in his place. Here was a man who truly believed in what he was saying and was willing to make his point without losing his composure. In that moment, the professor realized that she was up against someone who was not only willing to debate, but also adept at demolishing her most persistent myths. Her mustache slightly askew, watching Barron Trump. She was sure this moment would not be a problem for her. Barron was just a demanding student, the son of a former president, with whom everything was clear. He had no policy background, knowledge, or experience that could compete with her years of practice. She was an expert in social justice and wealth redistribution. Barron, she thought, was a classic product of privilege, his views closely aligned with his father's. She looked at the students. Barron, you know we're talking about real issues here, right? Imagine you're a young capitalist in America today, trying to figure out how to redistribute wealth. Go ahead, talk. How do you handle this? She said, smiling at him with her gun pointed at her. Barron rose slowly from his seat, his face calm, even a little thoughtful. He took his time with his answer, as if he was carefully choosing his words, and this was already alarming. Scandinavia is a great model, but, he began, his voice clear and confident, many people forget one key thing. The Scandinavian countries are really successful, but their model only works because they have a strong and dynamic market. The problem here in the United States is that many political forces simply manage poverty without addressing its fundamental causes. Barron paused, and the audience fell silent, waiting for the professor's response. Langley snorted. She thought this would be easy. Oh, so you're going to tell us about the Norse myth? You know that high taxes and strong government support are what keep those countries stable, she replied with a smile, not hiding her irony. But Barron didn't push the sport. He insists he's not giving her the chance to put him down. Look, I'm not saying that social programs aren't important, he said, his gaze growing more confident. But in Scandinavia, for example, the economic model is built on high taxes because that market is really growing. Innovation, new technology, that's what's at the heart of their success. We in the US depend on social programs, too, but unless we fix the economic model, they won't work effectively. We have millions of people who don't just need benefits, they need a chance at long-term opportunity. The students began to look at each other, and Langley felt her confidence slipping under her feet. She straightened up and, trying to save face, answered, "Barron, do you even know what you're talking about? You grew up in a world of luxury, in the elite. How can you talk about poverty when you've never had to deal with real problems yourself?" Her voice was sharp, a direct blow that she hoped would find a weak spot. Barron didn't flinch. He looked the professor straight in the eye. "Professor, I wonder why your arguments always focus on the privileged. Why do you think the problem with the poor is that they don't have resources? Maybe the problem isn't that they don't get enough from the government, but that they aren't given a chance to build their own future." The students were dumbfounded. Who would have thought that Barron Trump, the most difficult student, would question what they had been taught throughout their entire education? Langley fell silent. Her words stuck like a stuck bullet. She had not expected that Barron could so easily expose the weaknesses in her argument. "So what do you suggest, Barron?" she finally asked, unwilling to admit that she had lost control of the service. "I propose a change of approach. Instead of just handing out money, let's give people the opportunity to earn it themselves. If the market really functions fairly, if the state stops earning money on poverty and starts investing in opportunities, then we will have a solution that works for everyone." Then something happened that no one expected. The students began to whisper among themselves, discussing his words. Even Langley sensed that something was wrong. Indeed, she had lost control of the discussion, and Barron, with his calm and rational approach, had turned his failure into a real intellectual challenge. In response to the silence, Barron added, "The solution is not to instill dependence on social programs. We have to teach them to build their own future. That will be much more sustainable." The professor was trapped. She couldn't just dismiss his arguments because they sounded logical, and her entire enterprise was beginning to crumble under the weight of her throws. What to do now? Professor Langley felt the tension in the room. Her confidence was beginning to crack. Barron Trump, the little student from the family who had immediately left his mark on her perception, was destroying her ideology piece by piece. She had not been prepared for this turn of events. This was not just an argument, this was an intellectual battle, where every move she made was a losing one. A plan was playing out in her head. She was not going to give in. "Barron, are you seriously trying to convince us that your views are the result of deep analysis?" Her voice was almost venomous. "You grew up in luxury, in the presence of people who don't know what problems are. Your ideas are nothing more than echoes of your privileged life." The students perked up. Langley had decided to strike below the belt. It was the last trump card she had counted on. She saw Barron tense slightly, but he did not flinch. All her energy was focused on a personal attack, because she could not defeat him logically. A personal attack like hers always produced the expected result. Barron looked up, his eyes cold but confident. He knew this attack was Langley's attempt to distract from the substance of the argument. He opened his mouth, but her words seemed to cut him off from the immediate opportunity to respond. The students sat, their eyes glued to the confrontation. Each of them, it was now decided who would emerge victorious from this debate. "Professor, it seems to me that your arguments always focus on those you consider privileged," he said, his voice calm but every word on target. "Why do your arguments never address issues like these? Why do you think privilege only affects those who live in luxury? Maybe the problem isn't that rich people are always bad, but that the system doesn't give a chance to those who really need support." Langley felt her confidence slip beneath her feet. The students looked at each other. It was not an easy answer. Barron was on course. He was making no excuses, and most importantly, he knew exactly what he was doing. "Are you sure what you're saying?" she asked, with some desperate attempt to regain control, trying to make it seem as if her argument was an argument and his words were simply the reaction of a rich man. "Don't you realize that you're proposing to destroy the foundations of the social contract? I hope you realize that such ideas could lead to the complete disintegration of the social structure." Barron, not giving up, stared at her and replied, "Professor, throughout history, I have been the one who tried to change the system. The same people who challenged dogma became heroes. When Copernicus said the Earth was not the center of the universe, everyone laughed. Now we all know he was right. Why can't your ideas be wrong?" It was like the shock of an unbuttoning. The students caught their breath. Langley felt the ground slip from under her feet. This was not just a comparison. Barron had raised deeper questions she could not ignore. Are you suggesting that we believe that the system needs to change and that people need to think about the possibility of progress without this old dogma? Langley tried to salvage the situation, but her voice was already losing its strength. You think education doesn't matter? Which universities aren't the ones that should be leading society in the future? Barron paused for a moment, then smiled. Education is not just knowledge. It is the ability to think, to be unafraid to make mistakes, and to not succumb to old dogmas just because they sound good. Everything around her froze. The students began to talk quietly as they assessed the situation. Langley felt not only her confidence, but also her role as a teacher flashing in her eyes. She could not give a worthy answer. Every word she spoke now seemed empty and powerless. Barron won, but not on the level of words. He won on the level of ideas. Langley approached cautiously and tried to regain control. But it was obvious, she had lost it. The students quietly impregnated Barron, and he, without trying to be proud, simply shook his head, claiming that there was no other outcome for him. Professor Langley sat, clenched her teeth, and braced herself. She couldn't afford to lose face in front of this student, the son of an ex-president, who seemed so confident and calm that it irritated her. Everything she knew was on record. But she was still a professor, an expert, an opinion leader. And she had one last chance, a counterattack. Looking at Barron, she decided to change tactics. There was more at stake than just an ideological argument. She stepped forward, with a smile that was meant to be convincing. Barron, you talk about all the innovation and opportunities for people to solve their own problems. But you don't understand one thing. The generation you grew up in doesn't understand how important education is. It's not just a tool for personal growth. It's the foundation for building a more civilized society. Institutions, like universities, should be the ones that guide society toward progress. Barron seemed to know she was trying to turn the conversation around, and he was prepared. He knew her last trump card was to discuss the value of education. But he was prepared. Professor, what if universities, like academia, can be wrong? Look at history. Not everything that is officially stated is always true. Just think of Copernicus, who was willing to question everything that was considered true. For centuries, scientists believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. And what did we get? He was right. Why should we blindly follow a system that does not always observe new views and new data? Barron said this with such calm that the room fell silent. Langley froze. Barron wasn't just observing. He was raising questions she couldn't easily answer. She was used to teaching hard facts, but Barron was making her question her approach. Are you suggesting that we change the foundations of education? Her voice was less confident than before. She was thinking of casting Barron as an antagonist, as someone who was destroying the foundations. But something in his voice made her feel as if she herself was on shaky ground. Not the basics, Professor, the approach. True education shouldn't be about giving ready-made answers. It should be about teaching people to ask serious questions and seek answers, no matter what that system of thought is, Barron replied, leaving her no time to counter. He was persistent, but not aggressive. Langley tried to seize the initiative, but universities have always been centers of knowledge. Are you saying that all this centuries of experience are nothing? Barron, looking at her as if he were a complete supporter of thought, said, No, I'm not saying it's nothing. But if universities start putting restrictions on free thought, that's not education, that's propaganda. A true university should be a place where even the most fundamental ideas can be boldly asserted. Otherwise, we're just raising robotic people who will think only as we see them. The room froze. The students sat, unable to look away from the exchange. Langley tried to find an answer, but Barron was a significant independence. She felt the ground slipping from under her feet. It's very dangerous, Barron, she said at last, trying to find some sort of foothold. You want people to question everything they learn in universities? It leads to chaos and destruction. Barron looked at her with a slight smile, but there was more than just confidence in his eyes. There was a realization of the truth. Professor, chaos is not what I am proposing. I am proposing free thinking. I am proposing that people learn to determine for themselves what is right and what is wrong, and not win in a status that is always afraid to go beyond the generally accepted norms. This is not destruction. This is evolution. Langley stood there, trying to formulate a response, but he was right. She could have continued arguing, but she was losing. Barron had not only stumped her, He had made her doubt what she always believed to be the truth. There was a hush in the room, and the students seemed to be waiting for the professor to say something. But she didn't. Barron simply shook his head, as if it had been expected. And there was an expression on his face that Langley might never have been able to hide, the expression of a winner. After that last exchange of glances, Professor Langley felt her grip on the situation finally slipping. Barron Trump, the student she had considered an easy target, was firing argument after argument at her, and she couldn't find a way to counter them. Her head was buzzing. She felt her ideology cracking at the seams, and all her attempts to steer the discussion back to normal were losing steam. But she was a professor, and it wasn't going to last. Barron, do you really think that universities don't matter? Her voice was shaking, trying to sound confident, but with each word it became clearer that she was backing the position. Are you trying to question the role of academic education in a civilized society? Barron was slow to show up. He knew Langley thought it would make him emotional, but he wasn't going to give in. Instead, he just looked at her, as if she were another theory he could calmly look away from and pick apart. Professor, I never said that universities are unimportant. I say that they should be places of free thought, not revelations for propaganda. His voice was calm but determined. Instead of teaching students to think, we are creating entire generations who simply memorize facts and follow directions. That is not education. It is simply creating obedient citizens. Langley felt her world crumble. The words rang too true. She couldn't refute his terms because she had partially agreed with them. Yes, she had defended the status quo, but what had she really defended? The workings of a system that, in its latest developments, had increasingly closed itself off, depriving students of the ability to think. Are you saying that the entire educational system is a perverted creature? Langley realized that her tone had become sharp, but she couldn't help herself. What do you want? To destroy everything we've built over the centuries. All these universities, these traditions, they're all just unnecessary. Barron chuckled, but his smile was one of understanding, not disdain. No, I'm not saying we should destroy everything. I'm saying we should change the approach. Universities should teach people to be brave, to question everything they think they know, and to look for answers rather than just repeating others. That's how we've always lived, based on proven knowledge, on proven facts. But the world is changing. We have to be willing to change with it. Change. Langley was confused. Her world flashed before her eyes. She had always believed that her ideals, the ideals of fairness and justice, were what should continue. And now a student from a family that had always been associated with the political elite was challenging her entire worldview. Not her training, not her experience, but he, Barron Trump, was questioning her minimal essence. She looked around the room in despair. The students who had been sitting there with interest just a few minutes earlier were now watching intently as their professor lost the debate. Their eyes reflected the same question that had been tormenting Langley. Was I really wrong? Barron, sensing that the moment had arrived, made a final point. You know, Professor, this isn't about destruction. This is about us getting better. If we're not willing to question our beliefs in what we're doing, if we're not willing to expose our mistakes, we'll never make real progress. We'll just be moving along the same old tracks, expecting things to stay the same. And they don't. Things are changing, and we have to keep up with them. The ocean was deathly silent. Langley stood, not by chance, wondering what to say. She couldn't come up with a counterargument. She, a longtime teacher, had found herself on the side of the man she considered her coronavirus, and now her own beliefs were being questioned. Just as she was about to respond, Barron added quietly, but for all to hear, Professor, I'm not trying to destroy the system. I want it to be truly free and fair. That's all. The system shouldn't be a prison for thoughts, but a cradle for ideas. Langley stood silent. Barron turned with a smile and returned to his seat, expressing neither joy nor respect. He knew that his victory was not in his words, but in their consequences. The students, despite their reserve, began to glance at each other, discussing what they had heard. Even Langley could feel her unusualness beginning to melt. Barron Trump had not only won the debate, he had turned her world upside down. Langley stood at the lectern, feeling her world crumble. The students sat in silence, all eyes on her. She felt her confidence slipping, the sand slipping from under her feet. Barron Trump, the one student she had thought was an easy target, had unsettled her, and now, instead of turning this debate around, she stood before them, not least of all, wondering what to say. Barron had only proven that the world was not as stable as she had thought. Not only had he challenged her view of education, but he had literally opened her up to a new world. Students who had been listening to her confident lectures just minutes before were now looking at her expectantly, as if they were expecting something more from her. Langley swallowed, trying to find the words, but they wouldn't come. She had always been the one to raise her hand and defend her views with confidence in her voice. And now she felt the power fading. "So, you're asking me to review everything I've learned?" Her voice wavered. She tried to make it stern, but it sounded weak and almost unsure. "Do you think I've made a mistake about something important?" Barron looked at her with cold interest, showing no sign of health. His calm was unbearably irritating, especially now that she was trying to regain her strength. He did not try to humiliate her, did not look for weakness in her face. He simply watched her silently as she moved the soil. "I'm not saying everything you taught was wrong, Professor," he said, as if understanding what she was going through. "But you have to admit that this system doesn't work the way it used to. You say education is supposed to make us citizens, but if it doesn't give us the tools to really understand what's going on around us, doesn't make us ask questions, then how can it?" With every word he spoke, Langley felt her own convictions begin to erode. She wanted to respond. She could say that this was too strong, that the youth were not ready for such change, that tradition needed to win out, that stability was more important. But she couldn't, because inside, all her defenses seemed empty and unconvincing. She paused again, trying to collect herself with the help of the liquid. Her gaze slid to the side. The students were alert. Their questions were obvious. What now? She couldn't lie to herself or to them any longer. "I thought your position was just teenage maximalism. But you seem to actually believe in what you're saying," she finally said, as if admitting defeat. Barron didn't smile, but there was a hint of sincerity in his eyes. He knew she'd come to a realization, but it wasn't an insult. He wasn't attending a triumph. He was simply holding his ground. "Professor, I'm not trying to ruin your life or your views. I just want us all to start thinking more deeply and honestly. I want us to be able to actually understand what's going on around us, rather than just accepting it as it is." The silence in the ocean was almost palpable. The students no longer exchanged glances. The entire class watched this moment. Langley took one last step back and felt that she lacked the strength to continue this argument. She looked at Barron, and he stood with the same expression on his face as before, neither victorious nor enslaved. It was simply a calm determination. "You're right," she said finally, unable to deny the obvious. She said it without bitterness, but rather with an understanding that you can't always win an argument if you don't see the whole picture. "I was wrong. I thought the system was fine, but it really needs to be rethought. Maybe we really should start thinking differently." The students seemed to be incredulous. One by one, they began to whisper, and someone even clapped quietly. Barron did not notice how everyone began to react to this change. It was a consequence of the fact that this victory was neither his desire nor his desire for power. It was simply the truth that he wanted to convey to others. Langley, feeling defeated, said quietly, "Well, maybe we should all start over." Meaning she walked quietly out of the classroom, realizing that this encounter had changed her not only as a teacher, but as a person. Barron, for his part, sat in his seat as if this was an inevitable outcome for him. It was a moment when one student made an entire system look at itself in a new way. When the lecture ended, Langley sat at the lectern, trying to collect herself. The students slowly began to emerge from the environment, but the atmosphere was tense. This was not just an ordinary lecture, but a real upheaval that she could not avoid. Barron Trump is an opportunity for the student himself, who, it would seem, had not the slightest victory, but snatched victory by questioning his methods and beliefs. There was a silence in the air, heavy with change. Langley looked up to see the students approaching Barron, seeking answers to questions they hadn't had a moment ago. They weren't just impressed, they were fascinated. And the strangest thing was she couldn't blame them. Barron, sitting at the table, is not considered a winner. He does not extol his victory, does not grin triumphantly. On the contrary, he sits quietly, as if everything that is happening is a continuation of the Exodus. One of the students, a young guy with an anxious expression, approaches him first. "Barron, how could you just lay all this out so calmly?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "Aren't you afraid that your ideas might be taken as something that's happening?" Barron took a moment to respond quietly but confidently. "If you're not willing to voice your ideas, even if they may seem unusual or radical, then you'll never know if they can make a difference. I'm not afraid to ask questions, because questions are the first step to change. Another student, a serious-looking girl, joined the conversation. Do you really think the education system is broken? Her voice was soft, but it sounded like an invitation. Barron smiled and replied, I think it has to change. We've all been in these rooms for so long that we haven't noticed how limiting they are. We have to be willing to re-examine our beliefs and look for ways that open up new possibilities for everyone. This wasn't just a statement. Barron made it sound like these ideas were his personal truth, not some abstraction, but a topic he truly believed in. And judging by the expressions on the students' faces, they were starting to think about it, too. Langley couldn't ignore it. She watched her seat, feeling bitterness creeping into her. Barron had actually done something she hadn't expected. Not only had he won the debate, but he had given everyone a new perspective. Her worldview, her beliefs, her teaching methods, all of it was being called into question. When the room was nearly empty, she quietly approached Barron. He noticed her approach and, not expecting an attack, simply looked into her eyes. Langley tried to find the words, but they did not come. Instead of launching into a lecture about how wrong he was, she said quietly, You've done more than just have a good debate. You've made me see things from a completely different perspective. I'm not sure I'm ready to accept everything you've said, but you've proven that the most important thing is to just think differently. Barron kept quiet, not seeking any recognition. He knew this was just the first step. He wasn't trying to destroy the system. He just wanted to make people think that the system had to be open to change. As he walked out, the students' eyes followed him, filled with new questions, new ways of looking at the world. They found in him more than just the son of a former president, a man who was not afraid to ask his question. And that courage was inspiring. Barron Trump wasn't just a good debater. He changed the way students looked at the world. And that was far more important than any points in an argument. His victory wasn't about words, but about how it touched people's minds and hearts. Langley stood in the shadows, feeling the old her slowly slip away. She had just realized that teaching was not just about imparting knowledge. It was also about being open to change, to doubt, to new perspectives. Barron had won more than just debates. He had become a symbol of the importance of being open to change, and how easy it was to miss out on an important role if you weren't paying attention to what was going on around you. It was a lesson she would never forget. When Barron Trump walked into the classroom, no one expected a Trump family student to change the rules of the game. Not only did he win the debate, but he also forced the entire education system to think about its future. Professor Langley, confident in her own rightness, at a dead end, the student who saw the world through his eyes could never be the same again. He didn't just challenge my arguments, he destroyed her world. And if you think that's it, wait to see what happens next. What do you think will happen next for Barron and those who support him? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to keep this exciting story private.